All right, I want to pick up chapter 8, and I want to do this quickly, but I want you to see that there's something that is needed. At the end of chapter 7, we reached the point of a judgment. Everybody saw it, but let's be honest. What we've come through now is 36 body bags, 36 cemetery plots, now a pile of stones, and the horror of taking a life, the horror of killing a family and burning their bodies. I got to tell you something. That's not easy. So at this moment, when you get to chapter 8, verse 1, remember that they had been defeated, and now they needed a healing. They needed a restart button to press. One of the things that I see is if Achan had waited, legal spoils were ahead by the plenty. If he had only waited, there were plenty of spoils to be had in chapter 8. He jumped the gun and took what God said don't take. But just like when they were down there worshiping the golden calf and God was in the meantime up on the top of the hill giving great new plans for the worship center, if they just would have waited, they would have gotten their own worship center. But they couldn't wait. So, chapter 8, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and rise up, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. So, the sin was discharged, and now everyone was to get on board. Joshua used the original plan of battle, and he comes back up, and the strategy, by the way, is all the way down toward 8:26, and how he actually does it. But go to verse 2. It says, you shall do to Ai and its king just as you did to Jericho its king. You shall take only its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourselves. Set an ambush for the city behind it. So God actually outlines the way that the city is supposed to be taken. In verse 3 it says, so Joshua rose with all the people to go up, and he took this time 30,000, 30 Elephim. And this 30 Elephim means bands, clans, tribes, families, or thousands. The translator in English just chose thousands here. But he takes valiant warriors, he sent them out at night. And that's interesting. He's now going to come up, and he's going to come at night. You don't know this territory, but I do. To walk up from Jericho to Ai, you walk up along a sheer cliff. So he makes his way up a road that is a dangerous road to do at night. And in that way, it's not anticipated that he would be coming. And it says in verse 4, he commanded them, saying, see, you are going to ambush the city from behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. Ai sits on the top of a hill. So what he does is he splits his forces, and he sends some of them around from behind the city over toward the side that faces Bethel today. And so there's some people behind the city and people in front of the city. And by dividing up his forces again, you're strongest when everybody's together. But he's setting it up. Then I and the people who are with me will approach the city. When they come out to meet us, we will flee before them. Since we lost last time, let's use the loss to our advantage. We'll show up with only half our guys. Then we're going to run. You're going to hide back here behind these hills, and others are going to be on the other side of the city. And when we run down the hill, they're going to come after us. We're going to draw them out of the city. That's going to be their mistake. They will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city, for they will say, they are fleeing before us as they did the first time. So we will flee before them. And you shall rise from your ambush and take possession of the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. So while we are being chased by them down the hill, you take the city behind them because the army's gone. Verse 8. Then it will be when you have seized the city that you shall set the city on fire. You shall do it according to the word of the Lord. So I have commanded you. So Joshua sent them away. They went to the place of ambush, remained between Bethel and Ai. That's on the west side of Ai. And Joshua spent the night among the people. And Joshua rose early in the morning, mustered the people, and he went up with all the elders of Israel before the people to Ai, and all the people of war who were with them went up and drew near and arrived in the front of the city and camped in the north side of Ai. There was also a valley between him and Ai. And he took 5,000 men, set them in an ambush between Bethel and Ai, and on the west side of the city. So they stationed the people, all of the army that was on the north side, and its rear guard on the west side of the city, and Joshua spent the night in the midst of the valley. It came about when the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried and rose up early and went out to meet Israel in battle, he and all his people, at the appointed place where before the desert plain, which is on the east side. He did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Joshua and all the people pretended to be beaten before them and fled by the way of the wilderness. So they're running back toward Jericho. And it looks all just like the first time. And Ai is doing exactly what they had done last time. And Israel is doing exactly what they had done last time, except for they don't know that there's a lot more people waiting to take the city. So it says, verse 16, all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. So not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who had not gone out after Israel. And they left the city unguarded and pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, and I will give it into your hand. So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. The men in ambush rose quickly about their place, and when they had stretched out their hand, when he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it. And they quickly set the city on fire. And the men of Ai turned back and looked, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended to the sky, and they had no place to flee this way or that, for the people had been fleeing to the wilderness, turned against the pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city and that the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and slew the men of Ai. The others came out from the city to encounter them, so that they were trapped in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that, and they slew them until no one was left of those who survived or escaped. But they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua. Now when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field and the wilderness where they had pursued, all of them were fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed. Then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not withdraw his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Now stop right there. Why is it giving you the detail that they killed every single one of them? Why is that important to the story? Okay, first of all, there would be no continued temptation. This was absolute obedience. Second, this was one of the hardest things they were ever called on to do. You can read these verses quickly and not realize the power in the lives of the people that took the lives. Golda Meir, when she was Prime Minister of Israel, said, it's not who the Arabs are that bother me. It's what my people become when they kill them that bothers me. You have to understand, young men going out to fight don't come back the same. To take a life is not something small. And many of these guys had talked about it. They had been in warfare situations, but most of the guys doing this had never done what they did that day. So I want you to see that they went from an incredible victory where God dropped the walls of Jericho to an incredible defeat and routing to where they had to stand and burn stone and then burn the bodies of people and then go right into the war. But this time there's a tremendous new start beginning, a new turnaround that's beginning here. Now it's bloody, it's gory, it's tough, but it's obedient. And the bottom line here is that it says, Joshua burned Ai, verse 28, and made it a heap forever. Ai means the desolate place or the ruined place. Made it a ruined place forever, a desolation unto this day. He hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset, Joshua gave the command, and they took the body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the city gate and raised over it a heap of stones that stands to this day. So Ai had a rubble pile that was Ai, and another separate rubble pile that was the place of the king of Ai and his body. Now, look at what happens, because new victories brought new dedications. And in verses 30 and 31, you see a new dedication that comes out. Just as it says, then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal. Wait a minute. That doesn't jump out at you, but it does jump out at me. Mount Ebal is halfway up the middle of the country. They are fighting here. Mount Ebal and Gerizim are here. Half the country away. In other words, they got and finished the first big bloody battle that they just defeated the Ai, and they stopped conquering the land. They've got Canaanite cities literally all over the place. And they take this much of the country and decide to stop fighting. And they walk off the field of the battle and they go up to Mount Ebal. Why? Why would they do that? They go to Mount Ebal. Look at verse 31, because this is the reason. Just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no man had wielded an iron tool, they offered burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. All right, stop right there. First, we know that they were commanded to do this. They were to go up to Ebal and Gerizim. Where was that command? Does anybody know? It's in Deuteronomy. So you want Deuteronomy 11, verses 26 to 30, and Deuteronomy 27, verses 1 to 8. Deuteronomy 11, 26 to 30, and Deuteronomy 27, verses 1 to 8. This is an instruction that they are called, when you get into the land and you begin to conquer the land, stop. Go up and separate into two groups, one at Ebal and the other one at Gerizim. And I want you to pronounce blessings and cursings. Blessings and cursings. Now, so far in the land, they had the blessing of Jericho, followed by the cursing of Ai, followed by the blessing of Ai, followed by the blessings and cursings of Ebal and Gerizim. Does that make sense? Now here's what I want you to see. They were told to do this. Now, what offerings did they give in verse 31? Okay, burnt offering. What is a burnt offering? What kind of offering? It's a dedicatory offering. How much of the offering is eaten by Levites? None. How much of it's eaten by priests? None. How much of it is taken home with you in doggy bags? None. What is it burnt offering? Everything burned, dedicated to God. Why is there a burnt offering at the beginning of the conquest of the land? Everything we're doing is where you tell us to go. It is all dedicated to you. But what's the other offering? Peace is a shelmim. What's a shelmim offering? Like, thanks God, you gave me a son. What did they just get that they needed to put a balance offering back in for? The land. They just beat their first Canaanites in a field of battle. And when they beat them, they killed every single one of them. And as Israel marches out, they recognize that God has given Bethel and Ai into their hands on the Bethel Plateau. And so it's natural that they would come back and the thank you offering, the shelmim offering at the end of verse 31. He wrote these on stones, a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of all the sons of Israel. All Israel with their elders and officers and all their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native. Half of them stood in the front of Mount Gerizim, half of them stood in Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at first to bless the people of Israel. Then afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that was written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all of it that Moses had commanded, which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the men and the little ones and the strangers who were living with them. Why is he telling you this? What is it that Joshua is doing that's really unusual? Yeah, that is unusual. He's obeying completely, and that's true. But what's the point of this? What they did was a Bible readathon. And it doesn't just say he did this with the people. It says he did it with the infants. Somebody's standing there bouncing a baby for hours while this guy's going on and on and on. And then on chapter 47 and on and bounce the baby and nurse the baby and walk the baby and change the diaper. And everybody is there. He's saying the entire group of Israel stood there for a Bible readathon. You got guys over there going, fading, their knees are getting weak. And he's going on. Why is he doing this? Because he was told that he was to read these things and all of the blessings and curses and station the people on Ebal and Gerizim. If you will follow God, let's put this all down into a little capsule form. Follow me, have victory. Don't follow me, get squashed like a bug on the windshield. Okay? It's basically, that's what he's doing. Now, why would you bring the people up here surrounded by Canaanites, walk up there having taken one city of Ai, stand in the middle of Canaan, have a little Bible readathon fest, and what's the army doing? They're all standing there listening. In any textbook of warfare, this is the dumbest campaign you've ever seen. But in a biblical sense, this is do exactly what I tell you to do because I'm your protector. Your army isn't. Just go where I tell you and do what I tell you to do. And even though it doesn't work in the world, it will work with you. Now here's what I want you to understand. Remember that what we're seeing is confrontation with the world that begins the ministry portion of the life of Israel. So what does that inform you in? Go out as people of God. Be publicly aligned to God's word. It doesn't work anywhere in the world, but it'll work for you. Why? Because I said it'll work. The public proclamation of my word. Did you notice he includes not only the women and the little ones, but also the strangers who were living among them? He wants to make sure that everybody's clear. We just butchered people. So I need to stop now and go back to the Word of God and explain to you that this isn't just my ego and this just isn't human warfare. God is on a mission. Listen to me. People will come and you'll go out onto a mission field and they will say to you, what gives you the right to come into this people and tell them that their ancient gods aren't good enough and you're bringing Jesus to them? And in one response, the answer is the Word of God. That's the response. And the world will hate it. What? You're going to go into China and tell them that Confucianism isn't a sin. You're going to go into Brahmin Indians and tell them that Buddhism isn't the way and reincarnation. What gives you the right to walk the God who created all of us? And if you don't root it in the Word, you are dog meat. They're going to very quickly scoop you up and say, you're being intolerant of somebody else's lifestyle. But here's the thing. God called them to do it, and what wouldn't otherwise work, works well. Now see, what I think is there's a plan, there's a battle, and then there's a blessing. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 8, you can see in verses 1 and 2 that sin was dealt with and God renewed the encouragement. And you go to verses 3 through 9 and you see that Joshua renews the battle plan. And God encouraged Joshua and Joshua encouraged the people. Do you see how it went? God got a hold of Joshua, lit a fire under the leader, then the leader went out and lit a fire under the people. Passion flows from God whose plan it is, to the leader that he has anointed, to the people that he's called to do it, and then by the time you get down to verses 10 to 29, there's the thrill of the defeat of the people of Ai and the battle itself, and then you get down to the end of the verses 30 through 35, and you have the blessing and pronouncements of God. And the whole point is that the chapter is supposed to be an encouragement. Now, I want you to go to Deuteronomy 27 for a minute, and I want you to turn there for just a second. Because the key is encouragement, obedience, blessing. They're supposed to go up to Mount Ebal, and they don't even know where it is, so they're going to have to get a local to direct them. And they have to go to a mountain they've never seen, and they have to stand there and whitewash big rocks and put on them what God had instructed. And what's important here is when you're looking at the actual the idea was that they were to be obedient to what God said, and then God could pour out blessing on them. Now here's the point. After encouragement God gets the opportunity to see them obedient, and after obedience, God gets the opportunity to have them enunciate his blessing. Now, by the time I get to chapter 9, now something else is going to happen. This is the trick-or-treat chapter. Okay, what happens now is this is going to be one of those moments where the enemy is going to try and do something. I need you to see that if the enemy cannot scare you like a lion roaring, what he will try to do is deceive you into compromise. And that's what chapter 9 is. They've just come off of the great act of obedience. They've just walked out and stood there and listened to what God was going to do. And now an enemy finds a tricky way to come in behind them and to defeat them by deception. One of the things we have to recognize is if this story sets up the beginning of the ministry of Israel to the world and in front of the world and bringing the truth to the world, one of the problems is what you see very early on is the defeat of Ai was when the world stood opposed to them. Gibeon will find a way to trick them into a compromise. Now, what do they do? Well, obviously, in 6 and 7, they've been through a defeat, and in 8, they've been through a restart. So now we get into a trickery issue in chapter 9. It says it came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland and all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, Jebusite, heard of it, that they all gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they also acted craftily and set out as envoys and took out worn sacks on their donkeys, wineskins worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry, and they had become crumbled. They went to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal and said to him, to the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us." The men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you are living within our land. How shall we make a covenant with you?" But they said to Joshua, "We are your servants." And Joshua said to them, "Who are you and where do you come from?" They said, "Your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of the Lord your God. And we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, and Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who was in Ashtaroth. So our elders and the inhabitants of our country spoke to us and said, 'Take provisions in your hand for the journey and go and meet them and say, we are your servants. Now then, make a covenant with us. This is our bread that was warm when we left and took our provisions out of our houses on the day that we left to come to you. But now behold, it is dry and has become crumbled.'" Stop right there. Verse 12 is a blatant, patent lie. This was all warm when we left. No, it wasn't. It was crusty when they left. This is a deliberate deception. And it's laid out, and the problem is that the trick itself comes on the back of Joshua making one of his worst mistakes. Do you know where Gibeon is? It's smack in the middle of the country. It's northwest of Jerusalem, smack in the middle of the country. It's not where you would want to give up something to a group of people you're not going to get rid of. If the command in chapter 8 was so carefully obedient, and the command to wipe out and take all of what I have given you is all done, the last thing you want is right here at ground zero, right in the center of the country. Oh, by the way, we're not going to get that piece. What the enemy did was position people to be deceptive right in the middle of the heart of it at the beginning. And this will become a problem to them. And they did it through a lie, but they did it because Joshua was tricked. That meant that Joshua was going to face the fact that he, as the main leader, bearing the responsibility. What did Joshua not do that led to the problem? He didn't ask God. He didn't ask God. You know why? Because they just had an incredible victory. Here's the warning of chapter 9. On the back of the greatest victories of your life, you will become independent. And one of the greatest things the enemy tries to do is get you to live independent of God's will. You're going to see it again in David's life, where he's going to tell Joab to go or Joab to go and count the people. Independence is another form of rebellion. And in a very real sense, he got tricked into a rebellion. Now it's interesting because the guys show him the bread in verse 12, they show him the wineskins in verse 13. But here's the problem. Once they discover the trick, they have to be able to turn it to an advantage. So go down to verse 15. Joshua made peace with them, made a covenant with them to let them live. But notice what we skipped in verse 14. I want you to underline the words, did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. The great sin of Joshua in chapter 9 wasn't what he did, it's what he didn't do. The omission of seeking the counsel of the Lord is what put him right in the heart of it. Here's the thing. God had spoken to him, and he had followed God. And coming off of God speaking to him and following God, he thought yesterday's success, he could just ride on the coattails or glide into the next success. Here's the thing. It doesn't matter how incredibly powerful what God did for you in the past was. Yesterday's gospel doesn't change today's young person. You're going to have to do it again. Obedience has to be done over and over again. You've got to suit up for it. Now, when should Joshua have gotten a clue that these guys were lying? How could he have figured out that they weren't telling the truth? He kept asking and they kept sort of evading it. Here's the trick of the enemy. If you're not sure of this one, it's called the myth of urgency. You'll see it all the way through the Bible. One of the ways the enemy tricks you is makes you believe you have to make this decision today. You know, if you don't buy this car today, somebody else is going to get it. Now you have to stop and remember that it came out of a factory in which many others that look exactly like it were produced. That's the part they're not telling you. You got to get this deal today. I often think buy now before the price goes down. Right? Because what happens is, what they're doing is pressing a certain myth of urgency. What Joshua didn't just stop and say, if they're from a faraway country, what do they need this for right now? What was so urgent that they came rushing to us right now? He said they're from a faraway country and their bread got moldy on the way. We're not going to get to that faraway country anytime soon. We've got some time with this. One of the things that happens is in ministry settings all the time, people bring up things with urgency, and my antenna goes up whenever it's we got to decide this right now. Well, wait a minute. No, we don't. If God is still in the heavens, we probably don't need to worry about deciding this right now. The myth of urgency will come up in your life over and over and over. What happens is people drive a stake in the ground of something that they think has to happen right then, and then they sin to get it to happen because they're so upset if it doesn't happen right then. All right, now with the myth of urgency, he should have suspected something. But he doesn't stop and he doesn't ask counsel of the Lord. Verse 15 just says he made peace with them, made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. The embarrassment of this is he not only bought the myth of urgency and didn't seek the Lord, but he now dragged all the people into it. I want you to remember something. When you're the leader and you make the agreement, you draw everyone else into your sin with you. And see, leadership means you have less maneuverability to make mistakes like this. A lot of people are going to pay for this. It came about at the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them that they heard that they were neighbors and that they were living within their land. Okay, so the discovery is, the deception is up to verse 15. The discovering is in verse 16. And when the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the third day, now their cities were Gibeon and Chephirah and Beerot and Kiriath Yearim. These are right across the center of the country. They dot, actually when I leave Jerusalem to drive to Tel Aviv to go to pick up people at the airport, the ridge that I take is that ridge. It's the ridge that goes right through the center. The airport's down here and Jerusalem's up there. They just cut the whole center of the country right across with a covenant. The enemy just big time made a mess out of the plan to kick all the people out. You need to see how brilliant your enemy is. He'll find a way to get you to make such a critical mistake that it will in fact hinder everything else you do the rest of this book and all the way into the next book. Compromise in part came because of a simple trick. Now pick it up in verse 17. Sons of Israel set out, saw them, verse 18. The sons of Israel did not strike them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel, and the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. Put a box around verse 18. If in 14 the leader doesn't do right and seek God, in 15, he drags the leaders of the congregation in with him. And by 18, one of the outcomes is going to be an outcome of the enemy's deception will be division of God's people. That is invariably true. Now, here's the point. Was Joshua wrong? Now, how does he get out of being wrong? The problem here is going to be, we've got a real issue. Because he was wrong, how does he get out of it? What are the choices? Give me some of the options of what he can do before we look at what he does do. What can he do when he realizes he was wrong? Okay, he has the choice to break a covenant that he's made before the Lord. Is this a good idea? Well, it definitely has the downside of being like in opposition to God's word. What's his other choice? You would think that at this moment it would be a good time to stop for a long consultation with God. Now you got your people grumbling after you, and you're the one who caused the whole problem. Let's take a look at what he does do. It says, verse 19, but all the leaders said to the whole congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them. So they have agreed that breaking the covenant is not on the table. Then it says, this we will do to them, even let them live, so that the wrath will not be upon us for the oath which we swore to them. The leaders said to them, let them live. So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation, just as the leaders that had spoken to them. Here's the thing. They had just come through 40 years in the wilderness where they didn't have trees. Gibeon and the central ridge root of the country had trees all over. The forests were so big that when Solomon became king, he had a keeper of the trees of that area. Guess what the Gibeonites did? They were lumber workers. You've just gone 40 years. You haven't seen lumber. You've been cutting stone in Egypt and making mud brick in Egypt. Then you travel for 40 years through a wilderness and you have to build a tent and it becomes a national thing. You don't have the ability. So what God does is he turns the evil into good by giving them a whole bunch of woodcutters and kind of woodsmen to supply for them. So this is what he does. He says, then Joshua called them and spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us? We are very far from you when you were living... by saying we are very far from you when you are living in the land. Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease to be slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. Now, in the beginning, they were actually doing it for the people. Later on, they will be the people that help supply and build when it comes time to build a temple. And that's part of what he's got in view here. So it says, the house of my God right here is originally the land. Later on, it'll be the house of my God, meaning the temple. And he says, so they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you, therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you and have done this thing. We only lied to you because we thought you would kill us. Okay, now I want you to stop and evaluate their sentence. What was another option? How about move? So what they said was, We could move or we could lie about it. It was a pretty risky thing that they did, actually. They were counting on the faithfulness of Israel. Had Joshua filled them in on Moses' history with the people of Israel, do you think they would have counted on Israel's faithfulness? Yeah, God couldn't count on Israel's faithfulness. I doubt that the Gibeonites could either. But, behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Thus he did to them, and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord. That will be later, to this day, in the place which he would choose. So what I think you see is a Samuel addition to chapter 9, verse 27. And Samuel adds, by the way, they continue to this day even to supply for the places of our worship. And that's what I think is going on there. Now, what does that do? It not only puts them in a position where they have been compromised, but it sets up the next battle. And so, frankly, in chapter 10, you start into the next battle, and that battle comes about as the kings, the Amorite kings, go to attack who? They're going to come up against Gibeon. And because the people have been deceived into making something of a coalition with them, they can't let them die. So now what's going to happen is God is going to move. Now, step back for a minute. One of the things you should see throughout the book is the faithful character of God. Another thing is how separation or the lack of separation becomes the downfall. The third one is how the seeds of cooperation are sown and the seeds of division are sown among the people as they're contacting the world. And another one is that there's an opportunity to recovenant themselves to God over and over and over. Now, having said that, before we get a break here, here's what I want you to see. God's been faithful, but in the story, there's a whole storyline of how they contact the world or keep separate from it. I want you to think for a moment about how the enemy in our generations has made a change in the church. I might not be the only person who believes this, but I fully believe that if Hollywood shaves the hair of all the women in Hollywood, that our churches will be filled with bald women inside of a year. I believe that what will happen is whatever the culture is doing, the church is echoing. How did we get there? You know, in Western history, the great moments of Western history were when the arts proclaimed the message of the church. And now the church is chasing after the arts. One of the things I think that's happened to us is, how many of you think if a believer from 100 years ago transported into our timeline and actually came into our church, they wouldn't be shocked at the behavior and lifestyle of believers? What I want you to see is Joshua as a book is really a book about coming right up to and confronting the world, but it's got some key problems in it. All it takes is for the enemy to when he can no longer scare you, when he can no longer get the weak link inside of you to steal, then what he'll do is create a deception to compromise you into a problem, and you will end up fighting with that problem for the rest of the book. And that's what this book does. You've hit the middle part of the book. This is the minefield of the book. Right across the center band of the country are some places we can't take. They're always going to be not Israelite. And they're only right across the center of our land. Well, that's going to be a problem. And it really is. And that's how Judges ends up showing that problem.